Can you tell me about this picture?
This picture is of my dad, Sam Miller Sr. He was born in 1884 in Crimea, Russia. This was on probably his 18th birthday. I have a brother that looked just exactly like him when he was young. I was told that I looked like him when he was old.
What kind of person was your father?
Stern, stubborn. He always insisted we speak German. I remember him saying one time when I came home on leave, spoke to him in English, and he said, "Hast Deutsch vergessen?" Have you forgotten German? When the church in Golden Valley quit having German services, he quit going to church. And then he didn't go to church for the last 2 or 3 years of his life. And then my 2 sisters, who were not churchgoers, came home one time. They wanted him to go to church with them, and he refused. And he told my mother later I should have gone.
How did your father express emotions?
I don't know that he really expressed emotions. He was sort of stoic.
How did he cope with hard times?
Well, when I was growing up, there was really not hard times. We had plenty to eat. The work he did in the blacksmith shop, a lot of times he would get products or meat or something like that if people couldn't pay for the service that he was doing.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your father?
Not at this time, no. This is my dad's first family, his first wife, Maria Beckel Miller, and his family. The oldest was Sam Jr., and then Ella was next, and then Jean, and Emil was the youngest of his first family. Marie was killed in a shotgun accident in August of 1917. From what I've heard, they had been getting hay from a field away from the homestead, and they had seen some birds, and somebody suggested they take a shotgun along to get some birds for supper, and the shotgun fell off the wagon and shot her in the stomach, and she lived about 4 hours after she was shot. And they had to call to the oldest son had to run to the nearest neighbor to find somebody with a telephone or somebody to ride to where there was a telephone to get the doctor to come. And it took several hours till the doctor from Golden Valley came out, and she lived just a few hours after that.
Was that the closest doctor?
The closest doctor was in Golden Valley, yes, and that was probably about 15 miles. And I don't know if they had to ride into Golden Valley to get the doctor, and then the doctor came by car, or if they called, if there was a telephone there. Anyway, after Maria was killed in that accident, the children were sent to different homes. Sam Jr. stayed with one family, the girl stayed with another family, and Emil stayed with a family named Laborsky. I think the girl stayed with a Yankee family, and Sam stayed with a family named Beckel, John Beckel.
Right. Did you get to know these children very well?
I knew Sam probably the best, being he lived here in Beulah. When we lived in Zap, we would see him often. When we lived in Golden Valley, we'd see him often. He was the oldest in the family, and I'm 30 years younger than he is, but we had some common interests. We both liked the bowl. Sam was a good baseball player when he was young. I was a good ball player. The girls both married fairly young, and I didn't know them when I was young. The only time I'd see them was when they came to visit, and that wasn't too often. But then when I was in the service, I would be stationed near one of the girls, and I would see them often then. One lived in California, and I was stationed near where she lived. And the other one lived in Montana, and when I was stationed in Montana, I saw her fairly regularly and got to know both of them. Emil died when he was 18, so that was well before I was born. This is an auction bill from my dad's auction after his wife was killed in a shotgun accident. He had quite a few horses. He did not farm. He was a blacksmith. He had a blacksmith shop on his homestead, and then he worked at the village of Casimir at a blacksmith shop for Casimir Mastel. And I'd always heard that my dad had trained a dog to walk on a treadmill and pump water. And I didn't know if it was true or not, but when I saw this auction bill, the last line of the auction says, one dog treadmill, pump jack, etc., with dog. And I was very surprised when he sold the dog.
Sounds like an inventive person.
I think he was, yeah. That's probably why he could design these iron crosses that we're going to be talking about.
Right.
Let's go to one of his blacksmith shops. This is my dad's blacksmith shop in Zapp, North Dakota, probably around 1938.
And this was right in town?
This was right in town, right across from St. Luke's Lutheran Church. And for a while before we left Zapp, we lived right next to the blacksmith shop. My dad had a blacksmith shop in Zapp probably from about 1925 until the mid to late 1940s. Then he sold the shop in Zapp and worked at the Garrison Dam for several years. But I don't think he liked that because he was used to working for himself. And then he quit working there and bought a blacksmith shop in Gold Valley in 1948. And he operated that until September of 1949 when the shop burned down. And from there he retired. And he lived to be 80 years old, and he was a blacksmith for 52 years.
Where did he learn to be a blacksmith?
He learned to be a blacksmith in Russia. I believe the name of the man who taught him to be a blacksmith was Sam Stern. This was probably in the village of Krontal in the Crimea.
This one?
This is another picture of his blacksmith shop in Zapp. This was about 1940.
Did you ever work with him in the blacksmith shop?
I did not know him. I was only 11 when he retired from blacksmith, when his shop burned down. And if I was in there, I was probably just playing and getting in the way. My older brother, Sam, learned blacksmithing from him and went into business. They had a business together in Zapp for a while, and then my brother started his own shop in Beulah and ran that until he got sick in 1977.
Right.
These are pictures of my parents, one taken in 1932. My mother's name was Louisa Harshmiller. They were married in, I believe, 1927.
Can you tell me about your mother?
Yes, I think my mother was a good cook. She had a fabulous memory. Even now, I think I should ask my mother, and she's been dead 17 years. She could tell you dates when somebody was born or somebody died, or I think she was a very good cook. She would make Fleischkichle, but she didn't learn to make Fleischkichle at home. She worked for a family named Schimke, where she learned to make Fleischkichle.
Can you describe your relationship with her?
Yes, I think I was very close to my mother. After I retired from the service, I lived with my mother for 14 years before she died. I think we were close. She was very, she was quite shy. Didn't say very much.
Do you know how your parents met?
No, I do not. Probably at a wedding, probably somebody else's wedding. I think my grandfather's intentions were that my dad marry an older sister, but evidently she married somebody else before then, and my mother was probably the next choice. So my mother was not the oldest in her family; she was the second oldest. My grandfather, Gottlieb Harsch, homesteaded south of Zapp near Medicine Butte, and he lived on the homestead probably until the late 1930s. Then he moved into Zapp. I don't think I have any pictures of my grandfather here.
Right.
This is a picture of my mother and dad and my brothers Leo on the left, Hugo on the right, Gilbert on the front right, and myself in the front middle. This was taken in the summer of 1964, the year my dad died. He died in September that year.
Were you close to all of the brothers?
Yes, I was, yes. Well, we were a close family. In 1945, all three of my brothers had the unfortunate to be in accidents. First, my brother Leo went swimming and had a childhood disease, measles or mumps, whatever it was, and he had played baseball and then gone swimming, and he contacted spinal meningitis and lost his hearing. And I believe that was in probably May. And then in July, my brother Gilbert was hit by a car in Zapp and broke his pelvis. Was in the hospital for quite some time. And then that fall, I believe it was in September or October, my brother Hugo shot himself in the right arm with a shotgun while taking it out of the vehicle. And his arm is still scarred from that. If Dr. Vinci hadn't been here in Beulah, who had just come back from the Second World War, he would have probably lost his arm. But this Dr. Vinci had seen a lot of wounds like this and was able to save the arm. The only thing that don't move is his little finger. The other fingers function.
Where was the nearest hospital facility?
Well, probably in Beulah. I'm sure they took him to Beulah at first, and with my brother's arm, they probably took him to Bismarck shortly after that. And where they took my brother Leo when he had spinal meningitis, that I don't know. My brother Gilbert was in the Bismarck Hospital for quite some time. My brother Hugo, with his arm, he was in the Fargo Hospital for quite a while, doing skin grafts and reattaching nerves and tendons and things like that.
How often did you visit a doctor when you were growing up?
Probably not unless you were quite sick. I know all my brothers and sisters, they were delivered by midwives. None of us went to the hospital to be delivered.
All right. Did your parents have home remedies for illnesses?
Oh, I'm sure they did. I don't remember what they were, but they were. I remember my mother telling me that my brother Hugo had pneumonia when he was quite small, and the doctor had given up on him, and she pulled him through with mustard plasters. He got so bad that after he had contacted pneumonia, he had been walking before. He had been so bad that he couldn't walk, and he had to learn to walk all over again.
Right.
My brother Leo died in a rooming house fire in 1971 in St. Paul. My brother Gilbert died just a couple of years ago with lung cancer.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about your family?
No. Like I said, my sisters moved away here, and I didn't see them very often. My brother died, he had brain tumor, and brother Sam died in 1987. He was in his, I think he was 79. My dad lived to be 80, my mother lived to be 89.
Right.
That's probably the earliest blacksmith picture I have. This was either in probably 1930, 32, somewhere in that. My brother Emil and Adam Herman and my dad are pictured on this one.
All right.
These are the grave markers that my dad made for his first wife, Maria Beckel, and also for his son, Emil. They both have the names on the end of them, which is unusual. My dad made these probably between 1920 and maybe early 1940s.
Did he have a reputation in the area for being able to do things like this?
Well,
Decorative work?
I really don't know. I assume he did. My brother Sam did decorative iron work, iron railings on stairs or things like that, or he made some shelves that were made of iron, and I'm sure he learned some of that from my dad. So,
Right.
of course, I don't know about my dad's reputation. I'm sure he had a reputation, but it was probably mostly for welding and doing plowshares and things like that. That was probably the busiest thing they did, was with the plowshares. There's a couple of more of my dad's iron crosses with the names on them. Johanna Inzi, that was probably his second wife's mother. Her name was Carolina Inzi Halter. The bottom one is Martin Widener. The husband of I believe it was a cousin, Anna Knittel Widener. Martin was born in the same village and probably knew my dad before they both came to the United States. This is a picture of the Zap Whisker Club.
What is the Whisker Club?
Well, the Zap was celebrating their 25th anniversary, and probably if you didn't grow a mustache or beard, you probably got fined. And it was easier to grow a mustache or a beard than to pay a fine, because money was probably hard to come by. And this is my dad right here. This right here is my brother Sam.
Did they always require mustaches or beards for anniversaries?
I think for town, when a town was celebrating a special anniversary, like a 25th or 50th or 75th, maybe not now so much anymore, but in the earlier years, that was pretty common.
Do you know why?
I really don't know why. Probably somebody had the idea to do it, and somebody else thought it was a good idea, so they did it. This is a picture of me in either the first or second grade, probably my second grade. This is me right here above my thumb or my finger. I was probably about 7 or 8 years old.
Can you tell me about the school you went to?
Yes, this was in Zap. Went to Zap from the first grade through the fourth grade. I was not a very good student, probably a C or D student.
Do you remember any of the subjects you were taught?
Probably reading, writing, arithmetic, penmanship. My penmanship was terrible. I still don't write most things. I print most things.
Did you have a favorite subject?
Yes, I liked algebra and math. And recess.
And what did you do at recess?
Oh, probably went outside and played. We lived not too far from the school, and one day we went home. I was probably in the first grade. My brother Hugo was probably a junior or a senior in high school, and we went home for lunch, and they had a policy of locking the school door until a certain time. And we came back about 5 minutes before that time, and the janitor was standing by the door, but he wouldn't let us in. So we went home, and my brother got expelled from school. And that policy was changed. My dad went to talk to the school board, and they didn't lock the door anymore after that.
Can you tell me about any of your teachers?
I really don't remember the teachers at all. I didn't recognize the teacher I recognized the name, but not the face.
Okay.
But I do remember some of the teachers when we moved to Golden Valley. My fifth grade teacher was Lillian Ingbrecht. I thought she was a very good teacher. She taught the fifth grade in Gold Valley, then later she taught special education children.
Okay.
In high school, I was not a good English student, and one of the teachers sort of tutored me. His name was Wetzel, in order for me to pass the English test at the end of the year.
Were you allowed to speak German in school?
No, that was a definitely no. I'm sure I spoke English when I started school, being I was the youngest of the children. But I had a cousin who was just younger than I was, and he started school in Zap, and he did not speak English, and he got his mouth washed out with soap every time he spoke spoke German. But that was the policy.
Were there children of other ethnic backgrounds in your school?
No, I think they were probably basically Germans from Russia. Maybe a few other ones in there, but really not to my knowledge. Mostly German from Russia. That was probably all that Zap was in the early years. Even in high school, I don't know that there was any children of other ethnic backgrounds.
All right. Can you describe the building a little bit? How many rooms were there?
Well, downstairs there was probably the first and second grade were together, the third and fourth grades were together, and the fifth and sixth grades were together. I assume the eighth, seventh, and eighth grades were together. And in the high school probably had, I would say that was upstairs. They probably had 4 rooms for the high school, and then they had the library upstairs at the head of the stairs.
Were there a lot of books in the library?
I think so. I don't remember ever checking any books out in the library at Zap, and I don't remember the library in Golden Valley at all. I know there was one there, but
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about school?
no, not really.
Okay.
This is the Lusitania, the ship that my dad came to the United States on in 1910. They probably came in steerage class. I don't remember him ever saying anything about the ship. He didn't tell me about it. Maybe he told my older brother about it, but not me. In 1915, this was the cause of the sinking of the Lusitania by the Germans was the cause of getting the United States into the First World War.
Did any of your family members ever talk about what it was like in Russia?
They did, but most of the time when they talked about Russia, the children were told to children were not allowed to be around. They talked about Russia with their friends from Russia, but not with their children. I don't remember my dad ever saying anything about Russia to me.
Right.
I do remember my mother telling me that my dad and some of his friends played a prank on one of the women that was baking pies that day, and she had evidently baked a pie and they laid it on a windowsill to cool, and they stole that pie and ate it secretly. I remember my mother saying that my dad would take their horses down to the Black Sea to wash them off after working.
Okay.
Remember my mother telling me that my dad had told her about Fleischkichle in Krontal, Russia, where they would be pushing around on a push cart when something was going on in the town, like a fair or something like that. They would selling them to individuals as they walked by. And Fleischkichle is not German or Russian, I believe it's Turkish.
Okay.
This is a picture of my dad with a horse and buggy. This was probably taken in the late 1920s. When I saw the original picture, it was much smaller than this, and I didn't realize it was my dad. It had John Harsh written on the back of it, and I thought it was John Harsh, but I enlarged it and I realized it's my dad. So that was probably their form of transportation in the early years. Roads were not good, if there were any roads at all.
When you were growing up, did your family always have a car?
I remember him always having a car. My dad was not a good driver. I remember when we lived in Zap, we were going to church on Sunday morning, and there was a bridge not too far from the driveway of our house, and he almost drove off the bridge. He evidently forgot to turn. And when my brothers were a little bit older, they did the driving. My dad would sit in the back seat, and I'm sure he grew up with horse and wagon, and the automobile was unfamiliar to him. It didn't stop when you said, whoa.
All right.
That's my nephew Myron on the left of the picture, myself in the middle, and my brother Gilbert on the right. I was probably about 2. Probably had never had a haircut before that.
Your nephew Myron?
Yes, and he was older than I am. A lot of my nieces and nephews are older than I am, being I was the youngest child.
Were you close to Myron growing up?
I would see him quite regularly, and when he comes back to North Dakota now, he calls me. In fact, he's going to call me next. He called me just recently and said they were going to be here this weekend, so I'll get to see him. They live in Indiana now.
Did you often get together with extended family when you were growing up?
Yes, for birthdays, graduations, and things like that. Probably weddings. And a lot of times probably just a visit.
Did your family have big birthday parties?
I wouldn't say big, probably just family.
Did you have like a cake and gifts, or?
Oh, I'm sure they had cake. Of the gifts, that was probably that probably wasn't too much. Money was probably hard to come by, and if there were any gifts, they were probably handmade.
Right.
I remember at church on Christmas, you would get a Christmas bag. Probably had an orange and an apple and probably some hard candy and maybe peanuts. And that was something you looked forward to because it's not something you got every day.
What else do you remember about Christmas when you were growing up?
Well, Christmas probably either my brother Sam would come to our house or we would go to his house.
Did you have a Christmas tree?
Oh yes, we always had a Christmas tree. I don't have one now, but being a bachelor, I feel like, well, I've got a small one, maybe a 6-incher or something like that. But we always did have a Christmas tree, a lot of homemade ornaments on it. And
Did you believe in Santa Claus when you were growing up?
yes, as a matter of fact, I did. But even more so, I believed in the Easter Bunny, being I was born on Easter.
And what did you get from the Easter Bunny?
Oh, probably little baskets with hard-boiled eggs and probably candy, different kinds of candy in it. And
Did you dye eggs?
yes, Mother always dyed eggs, probably lots of them, and then we'd be hitting together, see whose wouldn't break.
All right. Is there anything else you remember about holidays or celebrations?
Well, probably in the summertime, baseball was a big thing on Sunday afternoon. Either you would play the local team or the team would go to the nearest town or the nearest farm community that had a baseball team, and you would spend the day at the afternoon at the baseball game after church. A lot of times after church, you would either, if you weren't going to a ball game, you would either have somebody coming to your house for dinner, or you would go to somebody else's house for dinner. That was quite common. The church had mission festivals each fall, and that was a big thing. That probably have a morning service and then a speaker in the afternoon after lunch, and then they would have a supper, and then they would have another service. Then my brother and I went to Zap one time when he was at home, just several years ago. And we thought, well, they're having Mission Festival. There'll be a lot of people there. And him and I were the only visitors that day.
All right.
My dad's brother, Wilhelm, stayed in Russia, didn't come to the United States. At one time, he lived in a village called Temish in Russia, and he was a correspondent to the German paper Der Staatsanzeiger. He would have letters in there probably weekly or monthly. My brother Hugo translated a couple of his letters, and he said Wilhelm must have been very educated because he used a lot of big words.
Did your father stay in contact with him?
I believe they stayed in contact as they could, but my brother was, my uncle Wilhelm was considered to be a counter-revolutionary in Russia, and probably in the early 30s he was sent to Siberia and to the concentration camps, and I really don't know what happened to him from there. I know he was born in 1889, but when he died I have no idea. I did meet one of his sons. His son Otto came to the United States in 1980 after looking for my dad's family for a long time. He looked. There was an article in the local paper where he was looking for my dad for 26 years, and when he found some relatives, my dad had already died, and my brother Sam, who would have known a lot about Russia, had already had a brain tumor removed, and his memory was completely gone. And my brother, my cousin Otto, lives in Germany now. I don't know if he's still living or not. Him and his sisters both were able to return to Germany. My cousin Otto was in the Second World War. First, he was a prisoner of the Russians because they didn't believe that he was German. I'm sorry, he was a prisoner of war of the Germans because when they invaded Russia, because they didn't believe he was German. And then they was drafted into the German army and got to Germany and was in American concentration camp or a prisoner of war camp. And when they asked him where he was born, he said he was born in Germany. If he would have said he was born in Russia, they would send him back to Russia, so he was able to stay in Germany. Maybe the reason my dad came to the United States and homesteaded where he did was he had had a sister, Frederica Miller-May, who came to the United States probably in 1905 or 1906, and they homesteaded north of Golden Valley.
Do you ever hear any stories about her?
No, I did not. She died before I was born. I believe she died on Valentine's Day in 1938. I do remember her husband. Her husband lived in Golden Valley, and I remember they would be leading me around because he was blind. He'd gone blind for some reason, probably cataract or something like that. But I did know a lot of Wilhelm and Frederica's sons and daughters. They came to visit my dad quite often.
Did you have a favorite?
Well, I don't know if probably the one I knew best was probably Irvin, being he lived in Golden Valley. And then I went to school with some of his boys.
Is there anything else you would like to tell us about her or her family?
No, I think that's about all I know about that. So.
Right.
This is a picture of my mother and dad's graves. Several years ago, they did an Iron Cross video, and they interviewed me about my dad's Iron Crosses. And one of the questions they asked me was, does your dad have an Iron Cross on his grave? And I said, I'm sorry to say he does not, but he does now. I had one made by Robert Greenshields of Dodge, to Samuel, our senior blacksmith. I think we've looked at all that. Well, maybe we can look at that one. This is that big one in the. This picture on the right is the large cross at the cemetery at St. John's, Wurtemberg, 7 miles north of Zapp. This is my brother Hugo and his wife Elsie on the picture.
All right.
This is the St. James Cemetery where my mother and dad and my brother Leo are buried. This is just north of Golden Valley.
Do you know who made the sign?
Yes, the sign was made by the same person that made my dad's Robert Greenshields from Dodge. Okay, this is my half-brother Emil. I really don't consider him a half-brother, but a full brother. He had bone cancer and was born in 1915, died in 1934. He was the youngest of my dad's first family. This is the church record from Russia of my dad's birth. He was born the 27th of April, 1884, the son of Stefan and Katharina Leithold Miller.
How did you manage to get a copy of this?
I went down to the Latter-day Saints, the Mormon records office down in Bismarck, and I found a copy of this. They had church records on tape down there, and I was able to copy it.
Okay.
This is the article about my dad's first wife being killed in a shotgun accident. Evidently, they were going out to get some hay with the horse and wagon, and they'd seen some birds, and somebody suggested that they take the shotgun along and get some birds for supper or other meals. And evidently, they hit a rut, and the shotgun was jarred loose off of the wagon, and it shot her in the stomach. And took several hours to get a doctor to come there from Golden Valley, and she died, I think, within 4 hours. And then there was 4 young children to worry about. I think Emil was the youngest at 2, and Sam was the oldest at 9.
Right. Did your father ever talk about her?
Not to me, no. But I'd heard that they both liked to dance. They would be dancing on tables, and people would give them money to. Evidently, they were entertaining. So.